Welcome to the Operator Overload Podcast, where we explore a variety of topics, old and new, related to computing. For more information about the show, please visit jimlawless.net/overload. Hi, gang. Today we're going to talk about PHP, which has recently turned 30 years old. So back in the mid-90s, when we were writing web applications, we often used a technology called the Common Gateway Interface. Now, the Common Gateway Interface leveraged a couple of things that most programming languages were able to accommodate. One was environment variables. The other was the standard input-output devices. So a lot of the early CGI programs were built in things like C or Perl, but they could be written in anything that could write to standard out, read from standard in, and had access to environment variables. So I've seen CGI programs written in Tickle and Bash and Delphi and just a number of other things. The way that those worked, let's take a look at a Perl example. This is a little example called cgiprog.pl, and it doesn't look too technically complicated here. It's simply got a bunch of print statements, and then it checks the environment to see if there is the presence of an environment variable called query_string, and it does something special with it if it finds it. So let's look at the top few lines, though. One of the first things one would do in a CGI script or a CGI program was start to output the HTTP response headers that were expected to help accommodate the client web browser to kind of help it understand how to render the data that you were about to send it. Usually all that we had to send it was the content type header with a content type of text/HTML. Now, if your CGI bin happened to be sending back a binary, you would change the content type header to, application/zip if it was a zip file, that sort of thing. For the most part, if it was going to be HTML content, it would be text/HTML. You'll note that I have two line feeds in that line, and the reason is that once the blank line appears, the browser treats everything else after that as the actual payload that's coming back from the web server. So the extra blank line there, the extra new line causing a blank line, that terminates the headers. Now the web server, it was usually Apache or the NCSA web server at the time, that would output some other headers. It would give the HTTP 200 response and any other headers, but the content type was up to the script. In this case, I'm saying we're just sending back an HTML document. So the next few lines simply write out a valid HTML document and then conditionally output a value that says query string is, and if there was a query string present, it'll display that. Then it closes the HTML document. So let's take a look at this in action. Okay, I have staged this on my web server. You guys can hit the URL if you want to. It's jimlawless.net/cgi-bin/cgiprog.pl. Now you'll notice the only thing we see is the hello internet, which is what we put here, and nothing after that. The query string is the portion of the URL that appears after the question mark if you're issuing a GET request to the web server. So when I put in a question mark and then hello space again, you'll note that Chrome turned this into %20 for my space. The query string here is hello %20 again. Now, in the Perl program, if I was actually going to use that, I would call Perl's unescape to turn that %20 back to space, and I would do some other things with it. But we're not going to actually try to do anything with it. I just wanted to show you that the value that we passed to it was communicated through an environment variable called query string in the case of an HTTP GET. It happens a little differently with an HTTP post, but we don't need to get into too much detail about that. Okay, it looks pretty simple. You people are probably thinking, hey, you guys had it made. You could just write these simple CGI scripts and you were on your way. Okay. There were a few caveats to writing CGI scripts back in the day. Okay, so let me show you the first one. The first one was the shebang or the hash bang. You had to be aware of where, if you were using Perl or Tickle or whatever, you had to be aware of where the particular interpreter was for your host system. Now, if you were running on your own ISP, you'd figure that out, or hopefully your ISP would have a help document for you or something along those lines. But when you were contracting CGI work, this could really vary. Perl interpreters could be just about anywhere. And there was a mix of Perl 4 and Perl 5 in the environment at the time. So sometimes you couldn't even depend on certain elements of Perl working the same way between those two from site to site. Okay, so the shebang was the first one. The next caveat, or gotcha, I should say, these weren't really problems. It's just there were things that would rear their head and you'd have to work through them, was the file extension. Now, in this one, I use the extension .pl for Perl, which is a common Perl extension. Some sites would configure Apache or whatever their web servers were to run CGI programs only if the scripts had a .cgi extension. And then no matter what they were written in, if they were in script form, the shebang should direct Apache to note how to execute said script. In many cases, the CGI bin was in all uppercase, but that wasn't anything that was prevalent. I think that has changed so that now the norm is it's all lowercase, but you could get a site that had CGI bin as uppercase, one that had CGI bin as lowercase, and in some cases, if you were running on a Windows web server, perhaps the case didn't matter. It would just load it as long as you had the letters in the dash correctly. Okay, one of the next problems or one of the next gotchas you might run into is that if you're like me and you were happen to be doing editing on a Windows box at the time, you might be using an editor that uses Windows carriage return line feeds to terminate a line and not just line feeds. There were many times that the Perl interpreters on the Unix side, which is what most of the web servers I dealt with were using, would not tolerate the carriage returns in these lines. You get a 500 error or something along those lines when you tried to execute the script. Like we had executed the script above here in the browser, you just get an internal server error 500, and there was very little to go on to try to figure out, what the actual issue was. Now, if you had a good sysadmin, they probably gave you some access to some logs, which would let you see some errors, and then you could go from there. But it were dependent on other people a lot of the time to get your CGI programs in a state where they could just execute. Some other things that you really didn't know about were the configuration of whatever your CGI language might have been. There was nothing really helpful that you could do using the CGI technology. You just had to know a lot of stuff. You had to be very meticulous about naming the directory placement. And in addition to all that, you also had to make sure that you had set the execute bit on the permissions if you were on a Linux box so that this could run. Usually the permissions were 0755 when you would place these files. So after all that, then you had the simple task of putting together CGI code like this. Okay. So in the mid 90s, it was 1995, uh, gent named Rasmus Lerdorf, and I hope I didn't mispronounce his name, had posted to a Usenet news group called Comp Infosystems www authoring CGI, which is it was one of the big sources of CGI programming information at the time. He posted about the availability of a tool that he had written called Personal Homepage slash Forms Interpreter, or PHP slash FI. Now, what Erasmus had been doing is he was doing different types of CGI programming for different people. He was writing his CGI programs in C, and he was finding that the programs had common elements. So he started to build a library that encapsulated these common elements. He could just reuse this library then onto onto the next project. So from one script to another, he would link in this library, and he had mechanisms to call. But in addition to having a library, he had built a templating engine. And that's really what PHP slash FI was a templating language that had variables and all sorts of things you could use with dollar signs. And his intent, what he had really intended this to be, was something of a framework so that other C programmers could use PHP slash FI as a templating language. Then they could add their own functions to his library or to their personal copies of these libraries. And they could do all of the detailed work in C while using something simpler for templating. Well, as history would have it, nobody really wanted to do that. People were more interested in PHP as a programming language. So over time, PHP became less of this templating system and C framework and more of a programming language. Now, when I first happened upon PHP, it was probably somewhere around version 3, and it was going pretty strong at that time. There was a lot of momentum behind it because all of the stuff we just talked about with the shebang, the extension, the CGI bin folder, carriage returns, error messages, configuration, all of that were pretty much solved problems. So let's take one last quick look at this Perl program, kind of burn this into your memories here. And we're going to take a look at a PHP program that does something similar. Now, I have got a file here called hello.php, and you'll note that the bulk of this is just normal HTML. This probably isn't unfamiliar to a lot of you who have come up through the ranks using Java server pages, active server pages, or other templating languages. But at the time, this was something that made things a lot easier for us. So you could work in largely HTML for the bulk of what you were trying to develop, and then drop into a programming language when you needed to generate the dynamic content. So here is kind of an equivalent of what we had in our Perl program, Hello Internet. And now let's drop into PHP. And if there's a query string, and if it's not empty, let's echo it out. Okay, so let's try this as a PHP example. You'll note that I'm not using a CGI bin folder. You can put PHP usually anywhere you want in an installation. So I've got this at jimlawless.net/overload/hello.php. I think I've left a bug in I had a line here while I was debugging this that basically said echo E is, and then $E. And I think I changed my local copy, but I didn't change the copy that's up on the server here. So pardon my bug. But this is the same sort of thing as I can add a query string here. Said hello again. Query string is hello again. E is hello again. Apologies for that extra E that's up there. Okay, so when I set this one up, when I staged this little script, I didn't have to put any shebang at the top. The web servers are configured to know where PHP lives and how to execute the files. The file extension is always or usually is PHP. So you don't have to worry about CGI versus .pl or anything like that. No CGI bin directory. It doesn't care if it has Windows carriage returns in it or not. Now, while I was placing this on the server, I had an error in my program. That's why I had a debug line here too. There was some logic errors too. Um, what PHP will do is drop a file in the folder, usually where the PHP script lives, called error underscore log. And in error underscore log, you can see things like what the syntax error was. This is all configurable, but usually that's how these installations are configured. So when I was writing CGI code back in the mid 90s, coming up into the late 90s, when I'd run into a PHP installation, things seemed to go much quicker for me than when using my preferred option of Perl and a set of Perl libraries that I had gravitated to. Okay, so PHP changed over time. This is probably about fair for PHP 3. I'm not exactly sure that the variable underscore server was quite the same back in that version. There have been changes over time. Um, in the evolution of PHP, some things that have come about are the inclusion of the Zend engine, which greatly increased the speed at which PHP programs would execute. PHP was it ran into some issues of performance in its earlier versions because it was usually interpreted and there was room for improvement. And this is what the Zend engine did. I think it was by PHP 4, I think they incorporated Zend and the momentum behind PHP just grew. Now, PHP is currently up into version 8 series, and it has adopted object-oriented principles and in a number of things like that. So the language itself has grown over time. If one were to want to play with PHP, one of the interesting things is that if you install PHP locally, now I've got a version of PHP installed in this Windows box, you can actually run PHP. Let's see here. With the command line, I'm going to run it off of localhost at port 8080. That's a dash capital S. And what happens is I've got an older version. I've got PHP 7 on this box. It tells me it's listening on HTTP localhost 8080. The document root is C overload 00010002. And I can hit Control C to quit. So I can actually hit localhost 8080 and it tells me no resources was found. No such file or directory. Okay, let's try it without the slash. Wow, it didn't like that. Maybe we should put, let's hit Control C and let's just create a PHP file here as an index. You'll notice I'm just typing in some basic HTML stuff here. And I'm going to type this in PHP and we'll see if it executes. I could just type in an HTML document with no PHP, and that is valid PHP. Just kind of a ways to do that, I suppose. Okay, so let's try this. Let's write it. Let's execute or exit. Okay, now let's go back over here and reload that page. Oh, would help if I started up PHP again, wouldn't it? So let's restart PHP. Let's try this again. Now we've got our hello. So the default setting in this PHP must be to have directory listings off. That's why I wasn't able to see anything in there. Okay, so now you can see the request. You can run PHP locally just using this -s option. Now this is meant for development purposes only. It isn't ideal. They don't recommend to use this to stand up a PHP application in production. If you're going to stand up a production PHP app, you should have a real web server like Apache or Nginx or something like that in front of your PHP installation. It's not a high performance web server that's part of this. So it's just meant for development. But it's good enough that you can just install PHP and you really don't have to have anything else, and you can do some development work in it. Okay, so I've used PHP off and on. It's handy because there's a lot of code out there in PHP that uses MySQL or PostgreSQL or various databases like that to implement some information driven websites, and it powers a lot of real websites to this day. Facebook had used it for a while and they came up with a PHP compiler of their own. And I don't know, they use a lot of technology, so it's hard to say where and whether they're still using it. But PHP remains to be popular. Now, I don't do much professional coding in PHP anymore, but I still use it for my hobby type stuff. So I use it for things on my website, and I'll use it for some things at home. If you're going to use it for your website, one of the things that I would point out is that one of the first scripts that I usually put on a website has to do with PHP's function called PHP info. And I usually drop a script onto the server that I'm hosting PHP on, and it just has this one call to PHP info. Okay, so I've got that in this folder here on my local host. Why don't we just run this? Now I've named it myinfo2025.php. When I place these scripts out there with PHP myinfo, I try not to use a name that would be common. I won't call it PHP info.php or info.php. I put something out there that only I would know. And when I'm done with this, I usually remove it, because what happens is when you hit this, PHP tells you quite a bit about your PHP installation. That one function call yields an HTML document that shows all of this information on your machine name, what the last build was, where it's located, what options it has available, and there's a lot of them, what libraries it has, basically a wealth of information about the PHP installation. I didn't want to, make this available for anyone else but me. I'm only using this for my own purposes. So a lot of the times, if I'm using PHP on a new web host, I'll drop a PHP info file with a unique name on there. I'll take a look and I can see what types of things it has installed. What you're looking at is what my Windows installation has. So don't get all gung-ho thinking that you know what libraries I've got running on my jimlawless.net server, because they are probably not the same. Okay, so if you're going to host something, I recommend that as a first script, and then I recommend getting rid of it. A lot of the things I do are with PHP are just off the wall stuff that would only be important to me. One of the things I found handy though is that because PHP builds so much in, um, it's fairly easy to write utilities that you can use at home. I have a utility. Let's see if I can get it straightened out here. I have an upload utility that I cobbled together from some code that I saw on the internet, which does a form style HTTP upload. And these are the type of things where if you go onto a site and they say upload here, click the button, you click the button and it comes up with a file chooser dialog. You select the files you want and they upload. This is the script that it takes to do that. There's a little more to it. Um, I found what I had to do when I was moving some large files was in the same folder, I had to have a file called php.ini. Now, the main PHP installation uses a configuration file called php.ini. That will be its own. What I've found is that you can extend that by putting php.ini files in a directory local to your scripts in most installations, and they can override the parameters. So you can add custom parameters to the PHP ini in most cases. So what I've had it do is accept files up to 10,000 meg or 10 gig. Um, the maximum post size, I gave it 20 gig. I don't know where these numbers came from. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense there, does it? And the max number of files in an upload 300. The reason is a lot of times I'll move large swaths of files from one folder on an old machine over. And I find this easier than mounting a file system sometimes. Or I can do files from my phone or from somebody's phone, and we don't have to get into too much of the nitty gritty about syncing up with computers and hooking up and things like that. I can just send them a URL. Now I have to run it a little differently because I have to run it instead of at local host. I have to run it on my local network. Local host is just the loopback. It's on my local machine. So I'm rambling here. Let us close that instance of PHP that was running on localhost. And let's talk about what it takes to run this particular script with PHP so that it runs on your network so that other machines can see your PHP scripts at home. So the environment variable on Windows, computer name, has your computer's name. And if you ping that computer name, with that /4 is to force it to an IPv4 address. You'll get a 192.168 address or a 10 dot something. It just sort of depends on how your network is set up at home. But this is my IP address on this node at home. Now, you can feel safe using this because these addresses don't exist on the outside internet. This is in your home or office network that would kind of tell you what your machine's IP is. So when I start up PHP, instead of doing localhost here, I would put 192.168.121, and I'm still going to use port 8080. And now the PHP interpreter comes up again, with the web server and all of that support, but it's now bound instead of to the loopback, it's now bound to my machine as a network address. And I can now visit PHP scripts on this machine from any other device that is on my home network. So what I need to provide is that prefix 192.168.1.21:8080. And I have an upload script there. Remember, we called it up.php. So I'm going to be kind of careful about how I type this in here, /up.php. Okay, now I have maximized the font a little bit here. What we're looking at is the content of this PHP script after it's executed. So the first thing it does is look to see if there was an HTTP post. There was not. We haven't posted anything yet. We haven't clicked a button that says submit, so there was no post. The HTTP operation we did bring up the page was a get. So it's going to skip everything in this if statement. So it sets up an HTTP form with the request method post. So when we click the button, it's going to go as a post. The encoding type is multi-part / form data. The input type is a file, which is a special input type known to all browsers so that it knows that it's that it's a file upload. And then this says I'm going to upload multiple files. Okay, then there's a submit and an upload button. Okay, so the choose files, that is the input element here. The input type equals file. We get our choose files button here. So when you click that, the browser then looks to see what we've got here. I've got a file in overload temp. It's just a text file. You know what? Before we actually take a look at that, let me show you something else here. There's a folder called uploads. Okay, that folder is empty. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and restart PHP, and I'm just going to reload this page. And I just hit Control R to reload the page. I'm going to choose files. I'm going to upload hello. So I've selected the file hello.txt, upload it, and this was relatively small. And since I'm doing it not really on the network, but machine to machine, it was almost instantaneous. You'll see in the log there was some activity here. I'm going to break out of this for just a second and go back and do the same directory listing on uploads. And you'll see now that we have a file here called hello.txt that I uploaded. That was selected in this section of code. So when we clicked on that button, we finally got a post. This function call tells us how many files are in the files collection. And for each one of these files, it gets the file name of the file and then calls a function called move uploaded file that moves it from PHP's temporary space to the space that we have allotted. And in my case, it was a folder called uploads. That's why we saw the hello.txt go into a file called uploads. This would have been hello.txt there. Then it echoes done. That's why we see it done here. And then it goes back and re-renders this so that you can post some more files. Okay, so that's kind of handy for building home utilities and things like that. One of the other things I have done with PHP is a friend of mine had a challenge that he posted on social media a few months ago. Let's see if I can find this here. Some of you have heard of the interview challenge called FizzBuzz, where you'll write a program that, depending on the values of an iterated number, they will output either fizz or buzz. But everybody knows how to do those nowadays. So there are some folks who have added some fun to FizzBuzz, and a friend of mine had talked about this FizzBuzz challenge called FizzBuzz Grid. The challenge required creation of a 13 by 13 grid of squares The squares were logically numbered 1 through 13 across the first row, 14 through 26 across the second row, etc. The number associated with each square when applied to FizzBuzz should yield a color for the square that obeys the following rules. Blue for fizz, evenly divisible by 3. Yellow for buzz, evenly divisible by 5. Green for fizz and buzz, evenly divisible by 3 and by 5. Or descending shades of gray for all other squares. So I wanted to take a challenge. I wanted to take a stab at this challenge, but I have multiple machines and I don't always write GUI programs anymore. It, the user interface stuff can vary from machine to machine if you're trying to use the native UI. So I figured if I'm going to do this, I might as well do something in HTML. And my first thought was to do this just in locally hosted JavaScript. But the solution came to my mind that, all I really need to do is generate this with PHP. So the PHP script I used to do this, let's open this up just a bit here. Boy, I'm not sure if we're going to get all this squeezed in here. I probably should learn how to be a little more economical with my code here. I built an HTML file and I started a count at 1 and I set a shade to 15. I would iterate Y from 0 to 13 and X from 0 to 13. And if the count was evenly divisible by 3 and 5, that is, if it's divisible by 3 and divisible by 5, then it's divisible by 15. I would set the color to green. If it was only divisible by 5, I would set the color to yellow. Only divisible by 3, I would set the color to blue. And otherwise, then I would come up with an RGB color that was equal amounts of whatever that shade value was. Now, when you have a red, green, and blue component that are all the same number, you get a shade of gray. So this would basically start out at 0F and work its way down. Work its way up, because we would increase the shade by 1 as time goes on, heading toward, let's see, more is brighter, right? So I think we ended up with dark gray shades that start to turn out brighter. This is just a capture of what that is. But in PHP, the solution was pretty easy. I don't remember exactly how long it took me to do this. I used a div, and what I did was in the div, I just made each square a little component of this overall div, and I would set the color to whatever this color variable was, both the foreground color and the background color. And I made sure that it had some spaces in there so it looked like little squares. So this was my solution using PHP. And you can see it live here. There we go. Reduce it. It's just at jimlawless.net, fbg.php. But this was just kind of a fun thing to do. So when I have a one-off, I tend to still use PHP for some of these things. And then I don't have to put together something terribly elaborate. Okay, so that's how I use PHP nowadays. A lot of people are still using it for professional work. It still holds up. It doesn't surprise me that technologies have risen and fallen during PHP's tenure. And I really think it's going to continue on, full steam ahead for quite a while. I have seen some folks say that when they're building applications that they intend to sell or they intend to kind of flip or things like that, they use PHP because it's easy enough to get something together to kind of get from their idea to their working prototypes and their MVPs and things like that. And if a purchaser wants something other than PHP, it's still pretty easy to convert from PHP to whatever other model you might have. It's still a very ubiquitous technology among hosting providers. You can get cheap, usually cheap hosting, like if you had a shared instance somewhere, it comes with PHP support, and there's just a lot you can do with it. Now, your hosting provider may impose some rules on what anything would constitute, but technically you could write or run any kind of PHP script that some of these hosting providers is just you know more economically viable in some cases than other options. So I hope to see PHP turn 40 and 50, and who knows. Okay. Shoot me an email if you're interested in, or if you have any questions about anything I've presented here. And the source code for everything in this episode, I believe, will be at my GitHub repository. Let's just put this up here really quick. I had it up here. Yeah, let's just go to github.com. That's Jim Lawless. If you look for my repositories, one of the more recently uploaded ones is called Overload. Look for episode 2, 0001002. You'll see the Perl script, the CGI program, the Fizzbuzz grid, and the upload script, and all that sort of thing. They're all here. Thank you for tuning in. Let's do this again soon. Take care.